why your financial plan is wrong. Oh, Josh, you got all the answers. Yeah, I don't have all the answers. I don't know, but I do know where a problem exists, and it's going to be in your financial plan. And my financial planning, too. And here's why. Now, if you had read my book, my last book, Relax and Retire, I got to get these freaking leaves out of my poo, you would have come up with a conclusion, hopefully. What I talked about is how there is volatility around inflation, all right? Volatility around inflation. So one of the things we don't want to do in retirement or in financial planning is we don't want to use a straight inflation around a variable rate of return. It doesn't make any sense. So we use a 3% inflation, assumes it can be 3% each and every year, but then we have Monte Carlos around the rate of return and a standard deviation. And so you're like, well, wait a second. Is there a fixed inflation rate historically? And the answer is unequivocally not. Inflation is up and down, just like last year, 2 years ago. It was, 9%? Last year was like 4 or 5 or something like that, and this year is supposedly around 2 to 2.5, whatever the hell it is. I mean, I don't trust those numbers, and you shouldn't either. And the reason for that, we don't trust these numbers, is because they take so much emphasis on housing costs and transportation. And when you retire, those are two costs that pretty much go away to some degree. Not all degree, not 100%, but some degree. Talking to some people the other day, this lady the other day, and her property tax, homeowners, and property tax, homeowners insurance, and something else, I forgot what it was, went up by double in the last 3 years. All right. Thanks, Joe Biden. Thanks, Obama. But anyway, so did it go up by that much in the previous 3 years? No. You see what I'm saying? So this is the issue that we have. We have to contend with the fact that investments, Monte Carlo investment returns, the standard deviation, are variable. Inflation is fixed. How can you possibly have a portfolio, retirement portfolio, when you have a fixed cost and a variable rate of return? It does not make any sense. Look at all those leaves right there. That's a lot of leaves. And look at that guy right there. So how do we fix this? Well, until we get some standard deviation and variability and inflation, I don't know how to fix it. I don't. So I use a flat 5.5% inflation for health insurance, health care each and every year. I use a 2.4% for Social Security, and I basically use a 3% for everything else. But it's fixed. It just goes up each and every year. The reason, and I've done videos on this before, and the reason why this, and then again in my book I talk about, if you actually look at a standard deviation of inflation, you should do a Monte Carlo inflation too. And I've actually done that with spreadsheets. I don't know how you incorporate that to a rate of return on portfolio. I don't know how you do that. In fact, one of the problems is how would you do that? So if you had a standard deviation and a variable rate of inflation, how do you measure that with a rate of return and variability there? I don't know. And what I mean by that is, if you look at the 60s and 70s, when we started going high inflation, then significant inflation in the mid to late 70s and early 80s, the rates of return were all over the place, right? And so, but were they random? I don't think so, man. I don't think there's random. I mean, so 73, 74, the markets were down about 45% in total. Was that random? No, because we had the OPEC stuff. So I don't know how you use a randomized inflation with a randomized investment portfolio. I don't know how you do that. But with that said, you can't use a fixed inflation with a variable rate of return either. I don't have the answer for that. I just don't. And the reason I have the answer for it is because there's no software that I'm aware of that allows us to kind of coordinate random inflation with random rates of return. And then you look at if you actually go back to 1871, you look at the Depression years. We had huge Depression years in from 1890 to basically 1902. Deflation, like significant, and the stock market did what the stock market does, is random. I don't know how you measure that. I just don't have an answer for this. But that's a problem. And so I'm running these numbers using Daniel Kuhleberg's 55e.co. And I'm going back historically, using the actual day-to-day, well, not day-to-day, year-over-year inflation numbers, year-over-year investment returns. I'm running different models and all that. And I was sitting there thinking, man, I would like to do this, but reduce the rates of return like Craig Israelson's does. And I can do that on Craig Israelson 712portfolio.com. The problem is a couple of things. A, it only goes 25 years, and that's fine. That's not a deal breaker at all. But how do you reduce the rates of return, and keep the same standard deviation and use the same inflation. That seems, because inflation is not independent of stock returns are not independent of inflation. There is some alignment here. You can't just separate them and say, hey, my standard deviation on inflation will be X, Y, Z. At random, my standard deviation on stocks will be X, Y, Z. Random, and we're going to combine these together. And that's a challenge. And for financial planners to not know about this or even just ignore it, like, oh yeah, look, we use a 3% inflation. Well, fixed rate of inflation, yeah. Well, how do you do that? Because in the 60s and 70s it was 3%, but we had a randomized rate of return, and basically all this whole decade, other than the last 2 years, we haven't had a 3% inflation, but we've had a randomized rate of return. So how do you use that? How is that? Applicable to me specifically? I get a random rate of return on stocks, but how is a fixed rate of inflation applicable to me when we haven't ever had that? Anyway, it's a challenge, dude. So I'm running these numbers, and I'm reducing the rates of return on stocks by 200 basis points. I'm just sitting there. I'm just like, the conundrum is, what do you use for inflation? Now, I'm using historic rates for inflation, but if you had stocks that gave you a lower rate of return, you'd expect inflation to be lower rated as well. And you just look at Japan. Then you look at the Depression area, literally the 1929 to basically 1937. Then you look at the 1890s, and you see stocks had lower rates of return during the Depression. Obviously, Japan had low rates of return with low inflation. I can't remember off the top of my head what the stocks did from 1890 to 1902. I just can't remember. But these things don't operate randomly. Is where I'm going with this, and I don't have a solution. But that's something to think about. So that was just FYI. I just thought I'd throw that out there while I'm cooking up some chicken on the grill, and I'm dousing them in marinade Worcestershire sauce, dude. Trust me, man. I just started putting Worcestershire sauce last night on my corn on the cob, doused in tons of. Oh, dude, that smells so freaking good. Doused in tons of butter, salt and pepper, and dipped in the Worcestershire sauce. Oh man, let me tell you. Put some Worcester. I don't have A1. I ran out of it, and I love A1. Yes, you're not a real meat eater if you use A1. Don't care. Sue me. I love A1, and I didn't have any A1, but I like something to go on my meat, on my steak. So I had some Worcestershire sauce. Just dip it in. Oh man, let me tell you. You ain't lived until you put Worcestershire sauce on your corn on the cob and on your steak, and then on your mashed potatoes. It's good. All right, God bless. Love your thoughts.